when I did, it was quite amazing because it was such a surprise. Because the first scene has that stilted acting and things, and I was like, oh my God, 2 hours of this. But then, it's such a surprise, especially the dance sequences, the mixture of forms, and giving us a taste of regional dances, classical dances. So, and the thought process behind the choreography, the structure, it was quite amazing. And especially now when we are all we are all forced to do digital works, we know how difficult it is to make a dance film. You know how many times it's shot, and it's really not an easy task. And what struck me was even the dancers in the sides, they were so good, not just the lead, the dancers. Yeah, and I actually, watched some of the parts many times. Yeah, so that was a surprise because I don't have much patience, so I didn't
Exactly. Me
expect to.
neither. It's hard to sit through a 2.5 hour film, right?
Yeah, and but it's just you have to get through that first scene of, that stilted, strange acting, and then, it's like a gold mine.
Yeah.
So,
It's kind of
yeah,
difficult to follow in the beginning. You kind of don't know what's going on, right? And is he supposed to be the young child? So it was difficult following it. Yeah. And then it got
yeah.
a little better. So,
Yeah,
yeah.
and then it's just a big surprise. It's not one of those dated old films, regular films. So that's what struck me really.
Great. So thank you for those impressions so far. I just received a message from IDEA just to sort of dive into the panel because quite a few attendees have been on since 6:30 p.m. And this is going to be recorded. So for those who are joining, this will be recorded and also available on YouTube after the panel discussion today. So for those of you who are just joining us now, welcome. We just completed the screening of Kalpana, which is Uday Shankar's 1948 film. It's a breathtaking work. It's very dense, but it's also full of great sequences of dance, some very important political messaging, and it's just an experimental film that has quite a legacy on Indian contemporary dance that we're going to explore further on. So just to reintroduce the panel for those who are joining us, we are starting a little bit early because the film ended a bit early. So I'd like to reintroduce Aparna Sindur, Raka Maitra, and Minu Basunag. And I'm thrilled that they're all here this evening with us. And I'd also like to thank IDEA, Shruti Mukund, Krishnavini Gurappa, Madhuvanti Sundararajan, and the whole Indian Dance Educator Association team for putting this event together. I also mentioned at the beginning, I watched this film with a dear friend of mine, Shagun Rena, who is also in the attendance, who's attending the meeting today. And I thank her for not only watching the film with me and translating sequences that I didn't understand in Hindi, but also just being pivotal for developing some of the questions that will be asked for today, because we talked at length about the film as we were watching it. So I thank her for that as well. I'd also like to thank and welcome Dr. Anita Ratnam. Hopefully she might share a few words about the film a little bit later on. And for those of you who are also are not on the Zoom meeting, as I said, this will be available to be recorded. This will be recorded and uploaded to YouTube very shortly. The link for the YouTube is actually in the chat in Zoom. So I thought we would just formally start the conversation now because it's a very vast topic we're talking about, which is Indian contemporary dance. Not only are we going to examine the legacy of Uday Shankar and Kalpana on the development of contemporary dance in India and among those of Indian descent in the diaspora, but we're also going to talk about how to define Indian contemporary dance. One of the major issues that is there is how do we categorize? Do we need to categorize? Do we need to fit Indian contemporary dance into a specific box? Those are all questions we're going to sort of unpackage together over the next hour or so. And I'd also like to take a moment to dedicate this panel discussion and event at large to another pioneer of Indian contemporary dance who passed away very recently, Astad Debo. Unfortunately, he succumbed to illness on December 10th of 2020, but he was a prolific choreographer and performer, and he really pushed Indian contemporary dance into a global spotlight. And this is dedicated to him and all of his great achievements and his brilliant singular vision for dance and movement in modern India. With that, I'd like to take a moment to allow each of our panelists to speak for about a minute about who they are, what styles of dance they are examining, what styles of dance they incorporate, and what styles of dance they even teach, and their relationship to contemporary dance. And they've shared with us some of their initial impressions of the film so far. So we're going to now sort of segue into more detailed questions about the film after the panelists introduce themselves. So let us start with Raka Maitra, please.
I'm Raka. I'm based in Singapore. So my training is Odissi, and I've also trained in Saraikela Chau. I have a small company called Chalk Productions, which has two sections. So in one, we run classes, which is the main income and which we all do. And then we have the company with full-time dancers. And we train the dancers in Odissi and Chau. And all our experimental work are drawn from there, just deconstructing those two forms. Yeah.
Thank you so much. We'll be speaking more about your work in particular in Singapore because it brings up some very fascinating questions about diversity. Because I know that in your dance company, you have a lot of people who are not just Indian in the company. And so it's very interesting to bring Indian movement on such artists. So we'll talk about that a little bit later on. So I'd like to now go to Aparna Sindur, please.
So I'm Aparna Sindur. I am based in California at the moment, but we also have a very active company based in India as well. I'm trained in Mysore style of Bharatanatyam with Dr. K. Venkatalakshma and Lalita Srinivasan. That's my core training, but I also am trained in Kalaripaya too, myself along with the co-director of my company, Anil Natyaveda. We create our own vocabulary for different kinds of productions, and my main love is telling a story. So whatever is needed to tell a story, I will do that in terms of like whether it's Kalari or aerial dance or Bharatanatyam or acting and singing and so on. So.
Wonderful. And Aparna and I share a connection because I went to college in Boston University, and that's where I think I first met you a while ago. But I'm going to be asking a question to you about your use of text and how to approach it from a contemporary perspective in storytelling. That'll come later on. Thank you so much. And finally, we have Meena Basunag, and I'd love for you to tell us a little bit more about not only your practice as an artist, but your institution as well.
Sure. My name is Meena Basunag, and I reside in New Jersey in the USA. And I'm the director of Nritya Creations Academy of Dance. It is a dance school as well as a performing arts company where we have two sections of the company, one for students who are training in the various classical forms. We do teach Bharatanatyam in the Kalakshetra style, as well as Lucknow Gharana Kathak. We have other established artists and educators that teach our students. And we also teach not only in the Indian domain, but we also teach in the Western domain. Our student company is required to take Indian classical dance as well as Western ballet and lyrical contemporary dance. And I personally enjoy fusing the both Eastern types of dance forms with the Western forms of dance form into creative compositions. And I try to do it in a more contemporary fashion where this generation in the United States, the students growing up taking Indian classical dance and Western dance, are allowed to create based on proper grammar and technique that we basically teach them as students in our institute. So they then themselves can continue the tradition and start to create. So I myself came to the United States when I was 4, and I did all my training here. My guru in Bharatanatyam was Padmini Ramachandran. So, and she happens to be debuting at age 16 in Kalpana. So she also worked with Uday Shankar directly. So everything is kind of linked together. Professionally, I'm not a dancer. My background is in technology. I'm an engineer, but dance has always been my passion growing up in this culture. I had parents who were near and dear to making sure that I keep the Indian tradition. So that's how I evolved. And I have 2 daughters who dance too. So I try to cultivate my passion and through this school.
So one of the reasons why I asked Meena Basuna to join the panel was to also bring in the pedagogical aspect of Indian contemporary dance, how it's transmitted to the next generation. So I'm also, just to be transparent, a Bharatanatyam teacher at Nitya Creations as well. So
yeah, we're very fortunate to have Kiran teaching our students. Absolutely.
Thank you, I appreciate it. So I need not really introduce myself because my link to Indian contemporary dance is as a spectator. My work in and of itself does fuse different classical traditions together, but I would not characterize it as contemporary according to definitions that I think we are going to construct as a panel. I think my work largely situates in South Asian dance in many ways, especially my most recent work on Kubera, which brought in Sri Lankan Kandyan dance for the first act. But I wouldn't call myself somebody who really is well-versed in contemporary dance. I've seen it, but I'm coming here mainly as a facilitator and not a commentator per se on Indian contemporary dance. And that's where our amazing panelists will have much more to say. With that, I'd like to segue now into our first question for anybody who would like to answer. The first question that I have about the film Kalpana is basically about how is this film reflective of the ideals and attitudes towards nation building and cultural ideals in newly independent India. And this is tied very closely to the development of classical dance in India. The various styles of dance were recognized. Who would like to start? Just take a moment to ponder your thoughts for a second. It's a loaded question.
Very simple question.
So in the meantime, Shruti Mukund actually sent me a message about Astad Deva, which is very interesting. IDEA had the opportunity to present Astad Deva along with the Embassy of India a few years ago. So he's also part of this IDEA family as well. So thank you for sharing that. Anyway, so back to the question at hand. Okay, so let me give you an example of what I had noticed in the film. Let's look at the use of Hindi. So Shagun had pointed this out to me, and I had noticed it in the film with my rudimentary knowledge of Sanskrit and all that. There was very deliberate use of a specific kind of Hindi. So for example, I saw that there was largely absent of Urdu words for, like, instead of saying ishq, they said prem. Instead of zindagi, they said anand. So, or so not anand, sorry. Anand is happiness or bliss. Zindagi, what's the word that they used? Jivan, exactly. So you can see how well I know Hindi. But there were very deliberate choices like that, which I think are also reflective of some of the attitudes, especially of the intelligentsia and the artistic elite in India at the time. And Uday Shankar was from such a background as well.
Okay. Exactly. And you also saw some Bengali slip in at that time.
Bengali.
Because also the elites that you were saying, a lot of them resided in what is now West Bengal, right? There were these elite, and he also met Rabindranath Tagore, right? And Rabindranath Tagore was actually a big fan of Uday Shankar, and he actually promoted his artwork. And not everybody in India accepted Uday Shankar at that time. So it's very interesting that Bengali slipped in throughout the film as well.
Raka, I think you wanted to say something as well?
Yeah, the nation building, the messages were very apparent, but what really struck me, at the in the beginning, there was a note from Uday Shankar which said, "It is my duty as an artist to be fully alive to all conditions of life and thought relating to our country." That was the message right before the film started. And since I started watching the film many times, that's what struck me, because that's what I think makes his work very contemporary. And it was really commentary of our times, of nation building, trying to draw everyone together. And what really strikes you are is that, what struck me was like some of the problems, I think most of the problems haven't been resolved. Like,
Absolutely.
the Northeast, when the Naga dance was happening, they thought it was a dance from Africa, those kind of things. And, the freedom of women, he talks about that. So, what really struck me is like, the problems we had 72 years ago, we have the same problems today. And at the end, he says, our country is sinking, or, something very melodramatic like that. And, sometimes I feel nothing's really changed, which is really strange. Yeah, that's what struck me. That's what makes it, I think, very contemporary. And I was really surprised.
Same, because I think one of the biggest takeaways from the film for me, besides that opening, which says like, "I'm going to say this. If you don't like it, I'm going to say it anyway," was what he essentially said. Um,
Yeah.
was this idea that the arts are what is going to keep the nation of India as India. So he was very
Hmm.
deliberate in his use of that kind of centering of art, to make art important, to make art central to for India to become the modern nation that tackles these issues that have encumbered it. And it's funny because even though Uday Shankar had this grand vision for art being such an integral part of political and integral part of economic and social life in India, now in contemporary India, that's really not the case. It's still that artists lack support from the central government, except the select few and all that. But, by and large, most artists don't get that kind of support from the government. Even here in the US, we have grants and all that. But again, the arts are not centered. So that's what makes Kalpana, as you said, very contemporary and still relevant even after all these years. Aparna, do you have anything else to add?
Yeah, one other thing I felt about Uday Shankar's vision of this new India, right? Because it just came out as a like a right after independence, and there is this welcome to India kind of this film of this artist's vision. Also, like lot of during the independence movement, as we know, there was lot of kind of like people talking about this revival, and I don't want to go into this whole revival debate at this moment, but at the same time there is this whole idea of, oh, this is what is supposed to be Indian dance. And then there is this Uday Shankar who is even in a way challenging that, because he was not only worried about the so-called classical traditions. He was interested in everything under the sun, pretty much. Like he was very fascinated by Western dances and folk dances within India, and everywhere, like you see in Kalpana, you'll see a lot of folk dance elements coming, and his use of music, and of course very influenced by Rabindra Sangeet, and you can see that. But I think he's embracing a different kind of India than what you would see within the Bharatanatyam movement.
Yeah, and I think that's what shocked India, right? The film watchers of that time were shocked by what he presented, because to them, the a definition of the identity of the new country was based on history and the old India, right? The traditional dance forms. So when they saw this contemporary, I thought there was a layer of dance, contemporary style that he first introduced in this movie that most of India hadn't seen before. So it was shocking.
And was also reflective of his travels. Remember, at that time, certain dancers like Uday Shankar and Ram Gopal were not popular in India. they were much more popular abroad. And so they
Mhm.
had crafted their art for the Western gaze, arguably speaking. In that, like if you look at Ram Gopal's productions and Uday Shankar's productions, there's certain elements of like exotica, certain elements that are like for the Western eye in terms of costuming that are just kind of really at odds with what is like indigenous to India. But he still made it a point to really use Indian instruments in a fascinating and compelling way. So that's what makes Uday Shankar like really a fascinating interpreter of movement and music and choreography. So one of the things I wanted to also bring up was that in the 1940s, this is also a time period where there's a lot of experimentation in film. And several research papers have talked about this, where there's the influence of like French surrealism in the films. I don't know how much we can go into that detail. It's not really necessary for this conversation, but just to bring in the Western lens and the Western gaze into all of this too. He was also very much in tune with what was going on probably in his travels, because he probably saw some of the films that were more experimental in nature by being in artistic circles abroad. And so that I felt like was also brought into Kalpana as well. So my favorite childhood movie, my mother's in the audience, was The Three Caballeros, which came out I think in 1942. It's a Disney movie, which blended animation and real film together with a lot of dance and music sequences designed as a propaganda film to promote Latin America. I love that film, but you can see touches of that because there was political messaging behind it, as well as animation and experimental use of film footage and all that. And I can see kind of that trace in Kalpana as well in terms of that. So now I think we have a comment from Leon. The biggest difference between India and US chose not to define the culture since it was an immigrant country. There's no Ministry of Culture in the US. On the other hand, India has Ministry of Culture and their defined styles of performing. Yes, I get that. But at the same time, in terms of institutional support, a lot of us artists who I've lived and performed in India. So yes, there's ICCR and all that. There are these panels, but by and large, institutional support beyond the government or with large scale organizations is not so much there in India. I know that there are people who could probably speak much more on this and more eloquently than I can, but those are my experiences in India. But plus I also am not an Indian national, so I didn't have access to certain things because of that. Anyway, so moving on to the next question that I have. This is actually now about the film's legacy in terms of how Uday Shankar and the film probably helped to start a movement for Indian contemporary dance. I'd like to get your thoughts on that in terms of like what you see the role of this film and Uday Shankar's institution, his choreographic style, his productions had on the development of Indian contemporary dance.
I would say that, of course, there is anybody, when we think of Indian contemporary dance, immediately, our mind will go to Uday Shankar because of all the amazing stuff he and Amala Shankar have done. And, like Amala Shankar also kept up the work, for many, many years. I think she recently passed away. So I think, a lot of credit goes to her as well, in terms of the creation of the so-called contemporary movement, because I am kind of hesitant to use this word contemporary only for a certain kind of dance, because I think every artist has her own or his own way of interpreting and bringing the contemporary into their realm, right? So whether it is a courtesan in ages ago, or a contemporary dancer on stage today. Having said that, of course, we are not like going on about like what is you know whose contemporary it is, but I think we are agreeing to a certain kind of aesthetic that is, going reaching beyond like a certain idiom of one particular form. And for me, what Uday Shankar's choreography strikes as is it's very theatrical. It has a very dramatic element in movement, as well as like there is it's not just a contemporary dance, it's almost like a contemporary dance theater, which has, you know, movement, also the music. And then there is in Kalpana you see the scripting. You know, of course some places it's really not, I mean, for a present day eye it seems like, oh my god, what is this, right? The way they're acting or doing things, it seems a little bit overwhelming. But you know, given, you know, if you put that aside, if you just see the choreography, it's really it speaks to something beyond just movement of one particular form. I think that bringing that together, I think, was his greatest strength in terms of like how he, you know, brought all these various forms and made sense on stage.
He also had dancers who were trained in these respective styles. So it wasn't that he trained dancers from scratch.
Yeah.
So there was a lot of that happens. It reminds me a lot of, you know, like modern dance companies or contemporary dance companies
Yeah.
here, where you have dancers who have already been trained, but you're sort of training them into your aesthetic or into your choreography. So the parallels between that sort of style of institution, or that style of of a touring production group is very fast, is also very different from, say, the Guru Shishya Parampara of how many of us probably studied and learned our respective classical dance styles.
Yeah.
So
And another thing that, you know, you can see when you see the dancers and the way they move, like even the child when it was very stylized, it was very, and you could make out they were all very trained bodies. And it's interesting that he used to martial art to train his dancers, because I think that he must have been the first one who incorporated martial art training into, you know, dances, fusing forms. Because often, you know, the classical teachers tell you don't learn another form, but he was the
Right.
first one who trained people in different forms using martial art. So you can see that even the dancers in the side, you could see the influences of Kathakali, you could see the influences of Chau. So he drew those things, you know, even that small boy when he was getting beaten up, you know, the way he moved, you know, when he went to the Pathshala and he was getting caned, the way he moved was very interesting. You know, it was a trained little boy. So those were things that were really amazing, the training, the bodies, and the way they moved. You
Yeah,
know,
that's
Yeah,
so
I think the unique, yeah,
that in
they
sorry.
were
terms of
trained
like,
in many different forms, not
correct.
just
Yeah,
one.
he was not a professionally trained dancer. He innovated this movement and technique. I had the pleasure of meeting his daughter, Mamata Shankar, at a friend's house. My friend was also part of Mamata Shankar Ballet Troupe here in New Jersey. And she described how her father used to just study pictures and paintings and come up with innovative gestures, body movements that are not defined in our classical artistic dance forms like Bharatanatyam or Kuchipuri or Kathakali. He did take inspiration and ideas from those dance forms, but much of the movement was totally innovative, started from scratch. And then he was able to train these other forms of dancers into his belief on how the body should move. So all innovative movement.
But
thank
you
you.
know,
That's what
Meena,
makes him
when
so
we
unique. So in my opinion, he created a unique form of Indian contemporary dance, not just by blending in all sorts of classical Indian styles, but just creating it from scratch.
Because he
yeah,
was
but
also a
Meena, yeah,
too.
okay, sure.
Sorry, Rakka, you had
So,
something you wanted to add?
you know, when we talk, I know they say that he wasn't trained in any particular style, but he developed his own methodology of training.
Mm-hmm.
And he
That's
was
correct.
a trained dancer, and whatever he did it in depth, because unless you know the forms in depth, you can't fuse. So
Later
he
on, he
studied
learned it.
sculptures.
Initially,
So
when he went to Europe
yeah,
in his 20s,
he,
he went to study painting. He didn't know
yes,
dance at all at that time, but he trained
yes.
himself.
Yes, but when we talk about dance training, like people are not trained, we immediately think about the training that we go through, the classical dancers go through, but that's not necessarily what is needed. And he started
Correct.
late, and it's fine if dance is there in your body. So it really breaks a lot of myths that we grow up with, that you have to
Right.
learn just one classical style, you have to
Correct.
start as a child. It breaks a lot of myths, and it gives you hope for people who start late.
He was born that way, right? Not
Yeah.
everybody has a luxury or being born with innate talent and creativity.
Thank you. This is a perfect segue because I think for the sake of our audience, one of the things that I really wanted to focus on was to really start giving a tangible description. I hate to use the word definition for this reason, but how do we describe Indian contemporary dance in and of itself, if there's a way to do that? But before that, I just wanted to double check. Dr. Anita Ratnam, did you have anything you wanted to add specifically about Uday Shankar, his legacy, and the film Kalpana and contemporary Indian dance? If you are there, we would love to hear from you as well.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? I just want to make sure that you can hear me. Hi, Kiran. Hi, Raka. Hi, Aparna. And congratulations to Shruti and the team at IDEA. I hope I'm visible and audible. I just wanted to share some backstories. I think a lot of you've seen the film, and Uday Shankar's son, Ananda Shankar, was a 4-year-old kid. He's also in the film. But Ananda and his wife, Tanushree, were very dear friends of ours from my years in New York. And once when Ananda was visiting Chennai, he took me to the house on North Bog Road, which is in T Nagar. It is a plot of land that Uday Shankar bought because he knew that he was going to spend at least 4 years in Chennai, and he built the house. He built the house, designed the rooms, because they had almost 50 people that had to be accommodated over 4 years. And to train the dancers, even before the filming began, he brought about 25 artists from Kerala to train everybody in Kathakali, the men and the women. It was really interesting to see. Finally, I think Amla Shankar, without Uday Shankar's knowledge, sold that land and plot for such a pittance that it really angered Uday Shankar very, very much, because the amount of time it spent designing the house, building the house, and housing and feeding all those artists. But apart from that, I don't know whether on the small screen you noticed, there was a technique called this back-end projection that they had to use at that time in filmmaking. S.S. Vasan of Gemini Studios, Chennai, was also a big dreamer like Uday Shankar, which is why they got along so well, and why he sort of gave the space for the filming. But there was another film that had just been made by Gemini Studios called Chandralekha, which is another iconic film. And in the history of cinema dance, if some of you want to, go ahead and Google, there is a famous drum dance, where gigantic drums were built and on which dancers performed without the facilities that filmmakers have today. But because Uday Shankar ran out of money, and because of when the war broke out and everything got delayed and the costs ballooned, they used some of the back projection of the drum dance from Chandralekha for as a device. So you will see, but I think you can only see it when you project it on the large screen, that Kalpana is happening and the Chandralekha drum dance sequences are also playing in the background as a shadow. So it's quite fascinating when you see it and you realize that even though S.S. Vasan gave the space, gave Gemini Studios, they shot day and night with Uday Shankar in very ill health due to just sheer stress. And in 1982, I'll just conclude by saying in 1982, when I lived in New York, I had the opportunity to present the Ananda Shankar and Tanushree Shankar Modern Dance Company. They were considered a modern dance company, India's modern dance company at that time, at Carnegie Hall. And in the audience was Indrani Rahman and actress Padmini. They were both living in New York at that time. And Padmini was launched in Kalpana as a teenager. That was her first role in cinema. Backstage, it was so charming because there was Padmini, who had not seen Anando since he was a 4-year-old kid, acting in Kalpana. And she called out, and it was such a joyous reunion. Indrani came, shared anecdotes of Uday Shankar, and it may not be connected to the film Kalpana, but it was as if generations were connecting via the film and via Ananda's parents. So I think I've seen the film many, many, many times. And as Raka said, it's not just martial arts. We're also talking about women's empowerment, his critique on child marriages, his opinion about what the modern woman should be like, women in salwar kameez, resonating with Tamil social reformer Subramanya Bharatiyar, who said, Nimirnda Nade Nerkonda Parve, which is what he said, I want the modern Indian woman to have a straight back, to walk straight, to walk tall, and to look directly, not to deflect the eyes downward, not to be submissive. So in a sense, there are so many coded messages in it, not just about the rich, poor, and about exploitation and other aspects. There's so many things that show that he was so prophetic. So prophetic. Yes, he spent a lot of money, I think depleted a lot of his resources. Ananda Shankar was joking, but I think there was also a bit of sadness that a lot of resources were depleted because of Kalpana, that the film was way ahead of its time, that the family went through very hard times soon after because it wasn't appreciated. As somebody said, it was a film way ahead of its time. So I'm just sharing these kind of anecdotes as we look back and we see that Uday Shankar created a pedagogy from Indian systems even before the word pedagogy has became used in dance practice or in the way dance is, thought about and methodically, built. So we must look at Kalpana and we must celebrate the film more. We now call him the pioneer or the father of modern Indian dance, but what did he cull from? He culled from painting very, very clearly, very assiduously, from painting and imagining what the movement would be like from just the still frame of a painting, like he did in London before going to join Anna Pavlova as Krishna. He designed the costumes for that and thought about how he would move as a dancer and how he would create those sequences with Anna Pavlova. So thank you for the opportunity and have a great discussion, everybody. And your generation should really revisit not just Kalpana, but the Indian movies that have used Indian classical and other folk forms. Today, Bollywood actually cannibalizes all these forms. They use a little bit of folk. I remember the iconic choreographer, Saroj Khan, who said that all her ideas came from a little bit of Kathak, a little bit of Bharatanatyam, a little bit of tribal, a little bit of folk. So she herself was also assimilating and creating her own from what existed around. She didn't take from jazz, she didn't take from modern. So it's a generation that I think we need to recall, we need to honor, and we need to celebrate. So thank you all. Thank you, Kiran. Have an amazing discussion. And I would like to leave now in a few minutes.
Thank you, for all your valuable insight and some anecdotes about the film and about Uday Shankar. Thank you so much. So with that, I'd like to now transition into our next part of our panel. So I wanted to really focus on just kind of creating language that we can use to talk about Indian contemporary dance, something that is very distinctly about this versus its relationship like exclusively to classical dance forms. Because I think, when it comes to the art that I have seen in India when I was living there and the art that I continue to see, Indian contemporary dance is its own genre. And it is, of course, especially with the work of Uday Shankar, Astad Devo, and those others who have pioneered this movement towards a contemporary approach to movement and choreography. It's important to also just give our audience sort of like, what is it that how do we characterize Indian contemporary dance in terms of aesthetics, presentation, and pedagogy? And more importantly, how does it differ from other styles of dance that are already there? So for example, Uday Shankar is Uday Shankar. Then we of course have fusion. Then we of course have Bollywood. Then we have of course people who are now doing work that is considered modern dance in India. And then we have people who are also doing work that is considered contemporary. So how do we now give structure to what we call contemporary dance in these paradigms? In, as I repeat, aesthetics, presentation, and pedagogy. And this is an open-ended question to whoever would like to answer.
Yeah, I think I can say some words. I think it's fluidity. And the movements are so fluid. It's like seamless from one movement to another gesture to movement. It flows and it's passionate. Passion through emotions and storytelling. I think that's unique about the Indian modern dance as opposed to Western modern dance. That's my observation.
Yeah, so even with modern dance, if we're looking at American modern dance like Martha Graham and all that, there is that storytelling element, but there's something that's inherently theatrical about Indian dance.
Mm-hmm.
How is that in relationship to what we would call contemporary dance, which is rooted in India and among Indian identifying practitioners in the diaspora and in India? So it's kind of a hard question. See, that's the thing. One of the paradoxes that I've noticed in trying to give a specific way to define what exactly is Indian contemporary dance, even all of us on the panel, we all have a background in classical dance. And also when we talk about contemporary productions, there's also the incorporation of folk arts, of martial arts. And so is contemporary dance also beholden to be defined by those genres of dance that have informed it as well? Or can it stand by itself?
I think in general, I mean, the contemporary is such a vast and loose term. It's kind of hard to, I mean, I guess because it is hard to define what it is, I think it works well with this word contemporary, in terms of even if we take, Western, like, in American contemporary dance traditions, whether it's Alvin Ailey or Mark Morris, or Javale Zolar, you see that they are also trained in a particular form, whether it's ballet or Haitian dance or West African dance. What they bring into their creation, it stems from somewhere. It's not like, of course, there are a lot of innovative movements. All of us are capable of coming up, and we do come up and we make our own vocabularies. But I think what is Indian, or like this whole broad term of contemporary Indian dance, is, in my opinion, is loosely connected to South Asian art forms, whether it's folk dance or classical dance, or where we take our influences from. I think that's kind of gives that flavor of Indianness to that. Otherwise, it is just because, I mean, if let's say a Indian body, like if I do a totally like Alvin Ailey type piece, is it still considered Indian contemporary dance? So what does that mean? So I think that is a very important question, but I don't think it's easy to answer or anything.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's too vast. It's just too many different forms of Indian dance we have, right? It depends what the foundation of that choreography is. Is it coming from a Kathak lineage? Is it coming from a Bharatanatyam lineage? Is it coming from a Western ballet lineage? So all these will have different vocabularies, right? So how do you define that under one cluster called contemporary Indian dance?
Let me give you an example.
I think.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I think there can't be one definition of what is Indian contemporary. Like what I think Uday Shankar set the trend where he fused forms, be it martial art, classical, Kathakali, then folk. There was a fusion, and where, but there was there was a rigor in the training, and there was a particular structure he developed, a particular structure in which the training was done. But my question is, like, what he did in 1948, that was absolutely contemporary. But when the troops do the same thing today, is that contemporary? That's a question. So, and I don't think we can really. Then there was Dancers Guild, which used kind of the same Ranjabuti and Monjushi Chaki. They used kind of the same fusion of forms. And then there was Chandralekha, who
Yes.
went a step ahead, and she used Kalari and Bharatnatyam and totally deconstructed. And with every performance, she was going more and more away from Bharatnatyam and more into yoga and Kalari. Then there was Astad, who used Kathak and hand gestures. And now when I think, like, some of Astad's movement, you can see, the way he used his hands were very similar to what Uday Shankar did. So there's a connection, and there is an evolution. So forms are constantly evolving, and we are evolving, and I don't think we can really define what is Indian contemporary dance, because we are all in different regions, we are in different countries, and we are doing we are developing our own forms. I think the basic difference between Western and Asian dance, as I would call it, because even if we look at the Southeast, the region, there is a common link, that is rasa and the use of the gaze, which the Western contemporary doesn't have. It's more about the physicality of the body. It's more about technique.
That's correct.
Ours is different. It's more inwards. I think that's the only difference we can make.
And I think you raised some excellent points, because one of the things that I was noticing about everybody's response is that, first of all, Indian contemporary dance is vast. It's also probably influenced by region, by language, and by local traditions. And that's something that's very Indian, right? That's what gives it that Indian feeling, is that sense of rootedness, especially in terms of like the styles that we come from respectively, the languages we speak. India is not India, it's not a monolith. And so I think we can start to define Indian contemporary dance as something that not only has fluidity and has some element of some theatricality and rasa and bhavam that is inherent in all Asian dance. But I think also you hit on this kind of idea of lineage. Like there's a progression. See, for example, if you see, like I've seen Padmini Chettur's work, for example, she's based in Chennai. I see the influence of German contemporary dance in her work, but I see at the same time Chandralekha, because she was part of Chandralekha's troupe for a number of years. So you can see this thread. It's almost like, we pay homage to our lineage, even as we deconstruct and as we reevaluate. Maybe that's what Indian contemporary dance is as well. What do you think? Aparna, do you have any thoughts? Meena?
I think rasa and bhava is not exclusively Indian. I don't think, I feel that it is like, well, like I remember seeing the very first time Alvin Ailey's Revelations. I mean, there is like so much rasanubhava, as an audience I experienced, and there is so much emotion and expression, and it may not be like same way that we express, right? We meaning the so-called classically trained dancers, like we have our ways, and even within that we have so many multiple hundred of ways to express. So I think that rasa, I don't think we can own it. I think it's for all to experience, and in that way it's hard to, that's why I'm coming back to saying it's really hard to say what it is. I think only thing we could do is, this is Uday Shankar's contemporary, this is Chandralekha's contemporary, and this is my contemporary, and this is Raka's contemporary, and so on and so forth. We have to, I think it's very personal and specific. At the same time, it has this big brush of like, this is all of this, because it is not following the um, Pushpanjali to Tilana
Yeah,
format in Bharatanatyam and so.
excellent. Because I think we're getting somewhere now because it's very, again, it's also couched in what I've noticed in like contemporary dance in the West. It's like choreographer based, right?
Mhm.
It's that choreographer's personal response to lineage, to training, to environment, to circumstance, to feelings, right? It's a very personal journey, I think, in contemporary dance, whether it's Indian contemporary dance, Western. It's some sort of like it's almost like a reaction sometimes. Otherwise, it could be an organic expression from within, but it's rooted in that kind of idea where there's a collective movement towards deconstruction, towards re-examining, and towards reconfiguring, but it's at a very deeply personal level. And I think that's what ties everything together. It just happens to be for Indian dancers who are exploring contemporary, in quotation marks. Maybe it's like rooted in that sense of what we call Indianness that Raka had sort of articulated in terms of regionalism, in terms of classical training, folk training, etc. Meena, did you have anything you wanted to add as well?
Yeah, but I think you can apply that to Western contemporary dance as well.
Exactly.
It's based on the choreographer, right?
Mm-hmm.
Their expression, their unique style, whether they may be applying contemporary from a hip hop perspective, right? Which is very different from somebody who's doing it from a lyrical ballet perspective, right? So I think that's true in the Indian diaspora and the Indian domain as well. It's except that we have much more, I think, complex, multifaceted forms of dance than in the Western domain, where pretty much ballet is your foundation. But in an Indian domain, you could be a Kathakali dancer, you could be a Manipuri dancer, you can be a Kuchipuri dancer, and each is quite different from the other, right? So the foundations in Indian contemporary dance can be very varied, right? Whereas in Western dance, I think most of it comes from some form of ballet as their foundation, and then it takes off.
It is also, just drawing the link between East and West for just a second. I feel like it is also about, in terms of Indian contemporary dance, Western contemporary dance, it's also driven by audience. And I think, like the sense of cultivating an audience, like, there's that process to do so because you're doing something new. You're chartering a new path. You're chartering, you're exploring something that is not necessarily the norm, as Aparna had said. Like, it's not following the Pushpanjali to Tilana. You're carving your own personal path with movement, with music, with dramaturgy, with all of this. So there's sort of like a in that sense, like, who is watching it, who are you creating it for, who is funding such artwork too, also plays a vital role in that, and curation. But this is a conversation that could be had for 5 panels. I also now wanted to turn the attention now, towards your inner artistic worlds, so to speak, because I think we've gone broad with like, let's talk about Indian contemporary dance, but we have such wonderful panelists that it's now time to really get to know you as artists. So I've developed a couple of questions for each of you that sort of are tailored to what I understand of your practice. And feel free to challenge me. This is not a panel where I'm right, I'm the voice of God. This is sort of what I had understood of your practices. And please clarify and please question. So the first question that I have is actually for Meena. So you had talked about earlier briefly about your training in Bharatanatyam and Uday Shankar technique. I'd like for you to speak in specific terms about how you applied, especially since we're talking about the legacy of Uday Shankar and contemporary dance, into the pedagogy and choreography that you've done specifically for students in grades K through 12 at Nitya Creations. Because Indian contemporary dance also deals with a lot of dancers who are adults. But I'm curious to see, in terms of pedagogy, how we transmit these ideas of exploration to the next generation?
Sure. I think it's exposure. I mean, I myself was not exposed to this Uday Shankar technique and style until I was in my early 20s. The first time I had the opportunity to experience it was at some cultural events. I'm being a Bengali, our family used to attend NABC or Durga Puja performances where Tanushree Shankar and her troupe would perform, or Mamata Shankar would perform. So I would actively, as a Bharatanatyam dancer and a student of Indian classical dance, I was mesmerized by their performances. I've never seen anything like that style of creative contemporary Indian dance. I've seen all the traditional and the folk and dabbled in that and performed in that, but I've never seen that. So I used to actually videotape these performances and come home and constantly watch them. And at one point, we were introduced to Sanjeev Bhattacharya, he's a choreographer. He lives in Cleveland now. He works a lot with the Cleveland Foundation, but he was in Mamata Shankar's ballet troupe, and Mamata Shankar is the daughter of Uday Shankar. So I asked him one day to come into our dance studio and teach us some of this technique, that he had learned from the Mamata Shankar ballet troupe. So we spent over the next 10 years devising new workshops, training our students who were taking Bharatanatyam and ballet, also about this technique, and exposing them to new choreography that they could relate to. So we even took some of his technique into Bollywood. We chose a semi-classical Bollywood song and integrated semi-classical choreography with Uday Shankar technique, a lot of the arm movements, the hand movements, the gestures that, Mamata also, of course, is the innovator in her academy, has taken the history from her father and incorporated into the Mamata Shankar ballet troupe. We exposed our students to that, and they enjoyed it because they could relate to the modernism from Bollywood and yet enjoy the fluidity of the movements and the innovativeness of the Uday Shankar technique. And they took on to it very well because they were trained classically. They are Bharatanatyam students, so they will be able to follow and mimic it over the years and incorporate some of this movement into their own choreography.
It's also about body conditioning, right? Because
Right.
some of those movements, for example, with the strictly Bharatanatyam body, I remember when I took my first gram class,
It's very difficult.
I thought I was going to die because it's such a different way of moving. And Christelle Stevens adds that many Western modern dances were deeply influenced by Indian dance. Exactly. There was a cross-fertilization of ideas that were happening. And you can see it in an artist like Uday Shankar, where performing for the Western audience, taking in those influences as well, and then vice versa. So there was mutual admiration of there. So when I took my first gram class, I had Pilates in me, so I could hold some of those particular holds and releases that are there in gram technique. But if I didn't have Pilates, I would have been injured. So conditioning and body
conditioning is important. That's why our students not only take Bharatanatyam, but they are also trained by experts in the ballet world. They learn ballet technique. So we have a multicultural set of experts in our school that teach both Eastern and Western dance forms. So the children are exposed.
So there is value to being able to specialize in multiple fields. And I think, as Raka had said earlier, like Uday Shankar, in and of himself, in terms of his choreography and approach to movement, challenged the notions of this monolithic, you specialize in one style of dance, you only do this style of dance. And it was like to promote a multifaceted dancer and a multifaceted mover and a multifaceted approach to choreography where you can blend. It's permissible to do that. And that's one of the things that's expansive about Indian modern and Indian contemporary dance, is this exploration of movements outside of just classical dance, right? So I'd like to now ask Raka, I haven't spoken to you in a little while now, but from what I've seen of your work, you have a multicultural, performing company where you have dancers that are not necessarily of Indian background or South Asian background. So I'd love for you to speak a little bit about, the experiences of working with such dancers and choreographing on dancers of diverse backgrounds, especially in some of your works that I have seen, such as the Pallavi series where you deconstruct various aspects of the Odissi Pallavi, and your dance theater work, The Platform.
We at Chalk, I train all the dancers. They're all trained in Odissi and Chau. These are basically the two forms I draw from. A lot of them are from theater background, and they come and start training at Chalk, and I train them for years, and they get onto stage only after they've been trained at least for 5 to 6 years. I don't look at race, I just look at the form. And at Chalk, I was like, when I moved to Singapore, it's nice actually when you move away from your home country and you start experimenting, because you don't have any baggage that this needs to be taught in a certain way. Like in Singapore, I could teach Odissi the way I wanted to teach. I did away with all the Abhinaya pieces, because what really interested me was the physicality, the Pallavis, and the pure dance of Odissi rather than the storytelling. So I developed my own way of teaching, and nobody questioned it. I did away with the Guru Shishya Parampara, I did away with the structures, and I taught Chau exercises along with the steps. So I did have a free, way of, I had no baggage. I think that was the biggest thing. So they're all trained in Odissi and Chau, and then depending on the story and what I want to say, I'll choreograph. Maybe a dance piece, maybe a production might not have much dancing, and maybe a production might have like an hour of just dancing. So but what really interests me is pushing the physicality of performers. How much can you push your body, because all the pieces are about at least an hour long, and the dancers are on stage throughout. So I like challenging that, the physicality. And so the dancers train, there's very intensive training.
Can I ask a quick question? When it comes to the dancers that are training under you, do you work with students from when they first start, or do you usually work with dancers who have had some prior training in dance and maybe another dance form? Or do you work with, what's sort of the profile of the dancers that you train and work with?
So, initially when I started, I thought I needed, when I started doing my own contemporary work, firstly, I worked solo for many years, because I realized that, I had to work solo to develop what I was thinking of, because, you also get clear of what you want to do when you work alone. And then initially I thought I just needed Indian bodies, and I could train Indian bodies trained in, some form of Indian dance. But then I discovered that it's very difficult, because, in our tradition, when you've learned Bharatnatyam, you only learn Bharatnatyam. So it like gets into the body. So to undo that takes a long time. Then I discovered that, people coming from a theater background, who've done movement theater but have never danced before, was easier to work on than to get classically trained dancers where you have a lot to undo. So, yeah, so that was a discovery I made. So I just look at people who know how to use their spine, whose spine is alive, who have a center, and then they can be trained. They could be from any background, sometimes ballet trained, or I find it difficult to work with people who are absolutely ballet trained, or they are absolutely from a Bharatnatyam background. Then they're very, I feel they have a certain way of moving, and they are well trained bodies, beautiful bodies, but difficult to work with.
Oh,
I agree, Raka. And this is what I found, that if you train from your early childhood years, in two forms of dance at the same time, you produce a much more flexible body, an open mind to take on different ideas. So it's much easier to develop that dancer simultaneously training both, for example, in Bharatanatyam and ballet, than it is to do Bharatanatyam for many years and then try ballet, or vice versa. You get a much more flexible dancer if you promote the study of both art forms at the same time. We found that as an experiment. I've been doing it for the last 20 years, and our most flexible dancers are the ones that trained in two forms of dance simultaneously. It wasn't easy, but it does complement each other very, very well.
I can tell you as a teacher at Nitya Creations, working with some of your senior students, it was very easy. As you had said, Raka, there's an ease when you have a body that hasn't been like, I hate to use the word like sort of molded, but it's sort of like, you know, my Bharatanatyam body, for example, finds certain things very, very difficult. Even though, you know, I may be called a natural dancer, when you put me into another class, you'll see right away that's not necessarily the case for that very reason. Aparna, did you want to elaborate on this further? Because I have some specific questions for you about text and the use of text in sort of a contemporary way as well. But before I get to that, do you have anything else you wanted to add about dancers, training, pedagogy?
So what we do in our company and also in our school is we offer classes in Bharatanatyam, Kalaripayattu, and yoga, and occasionally Bollywood as well. So most of our students are trained in all of these, but at the same time, some of them, go deep into Bharatanatyam or Kalari, one of the other, or sometimes both. But when anybody joins, I mean, we don't necessarily work only with our students, we work with all kinds of people. And we also have a program called Dance for Everyone, where we offer free dance and martial arts training, and we have more than 200 students in that. So within that, some of them join the company, and it doesn't matter where they come from, their background. Some of them are ballet dancers, some are modern, and some are Bharatanatyam. We retrain them. It's like each production is a course in itself. Like there are several months to years of training in Kalari, and sometimes aerial dancing, and theater and acting and so on. So it is a very intensive training oriented work. So it's not, we cannot like bring people and put them and make the production and go. So it is very time consuming, and like most of all of us, what we do is about that. And I think because also dance is itself like a very training focused discipline, and it also is very unforgiving. Like if you're an actor, you can be acting for a long time, different roles, and body may be like aging and getting weaker or so on. You still can imagine roles and do things. And with dance, it becomes doubly hard. And I'm very interested in exploring various ways of moving, and also like keeping engaged within this movement, and keeping upkeep of the body in a way that it is beneficial for long term, the wellness of the dancer. So that we work on that a lot in terms of our, especially when we go into production, we all do kalari every day, and massage and things like that. That is the upkeep of the body is very, very crucial, I think.
And I think that's really comes from a multifaceted approach to movement, because it's almost like you're training dancers for the production and what the production demands, not necessarily just training for the sake of pedagogy. So I think that's also an important distinction. So we're kind of running a little bit out of time, but I don't want to shortchange you. So I'd like to, Aparna, would you mind speaking a little bit more about your experimental treatment of text? Especially, I've seen a story and a song a long time ago, and Encounters in particular were two works that I remember of yours that also incorporated text in very compelling ways. And in addition to that, would you be able to talk about some of the specific challenges or the specific successes that you've had with building an audience for your work?
Yeah, so I'll start with story and a song because that came first. I mean, kind of like so a story and a song is kind of inspired by my love for stories and also like from the translation of A.K. Ramanujan's Flowering Tree and a story called A Story and a Song, and also a few Native American stories, all talking about women and environment in different ways. So I was doing this series of workshops when I was living in Boston with South Asian women, and then they came from different backgrounds. They were not at all dancers or anything. They were like some of them working in factories, some of them, doing other odd jobs. So, and they were talking about their stories of immigration and a personal narration and how women tell stories or not tell stories. So there were all these imageries that I picked up from those meetings. I mean, none of it was recorded or anything, but we had these like very intense sharing of stories. So I just then started looking at stories outside our circle, and then I remembered the story of Flowering Tree because I'm a Kannada speaking person, so I had heard my mom tell this story. So then it was in Nika Ramanujan's book, so it kind of like brought me back to that. So, and when we were in rehearsal for that, it's about a woman who can become a flowering tree. So, and then we had all these ideas of how to make a tree. Do you stand like a tree or make it tabloid and so on. And then we decided to go with tree in the air, like create that image of like tree is flying kind of thing. So that's how the aerial element came into the being, because I'm saying this because the story led me to that particular journey. It was not like, oh, how about let me put aerial dance here. It wasn't from that. It's actually from this to that. The text or the poetry within the text led to that, because the story is there, and then SM Raju and I, we made the script for the production. As we were going through it, there were like, just for exercise, Anil had put up the rope, so we would just climb up and down each day to warm up and all that. So then as we were doing this, it was like, oh, maybe the tree is here, not in here. So that's how it came about. And so the text led to this particular revelation, in some sense. And in Encounter was first a solo. It is inspired by Mahashweta Devi's Draupadi, that story, and I did it as a solo several years. And then Anil saw the video and he's like, how about we make it into a group production, because it needed a backstory, because it's very intense and very dark. So I had given up on that production because it was too much to go on doing about it. So then we made a backstory. How did this come to this place of rape and torture? What happened before? So that's the story we wrote and brought Mahashweta Devi's ending into our production. So that's the encounter of the military and the police brutality against indigenous people.
Got it. So you not only use written text, but you also use testimonials. You've also used your own creative writing. And so you approach text from a multi-layered perspective, rather than just saying like, I'm going to interpret what is here. And I think that's sort
And
of
also I think the love for text is also because my mother is a Kannada writer, Sri Valli, and she brought in a lot of poetry and words long before I started these experiments with actually taking up a story, right? So I've done like with using contemporary poems and things like that, was part of my choreographic journey early on, and then it led from there to something else which is more dear to my heart, that is love.
Thank you. Fabulous. So just to summarize now, for our audience, thank you so much for staying on with us. I know that we are past 10:10, so I wanted to now turn our attention to the questions from the audience. But before that, I just wanted to sort of see if I can sum up what was just discussed. One thing that I have noticed that everybody in the panel has been doing is the production, the ideas that you want to convey oftentimes drive the choreographic process, versus trying to sort of fit something into a paradigm that may not necessarily work. And that's sort of like the key to experimentation. And that's sort of like the key to contemporary dance at large. It's like the questions that drive you and the journey that you take in terms of finding movement, finding media to express that, I think is something that everybody seems to have in common. Whether it is, you know, engaging with the audiences of tomorrow and today, engaging with the dancers of today and tomorrow and their issues and what drives them as well is kind of a big part of this exploration that we all are trying to do. And so with classical Indian dance, this leads us to our first question from Madhuvanti Sundararajan, who is also part of IDEA. And I'm going to read the question verbatim. So she said, as you had mentioned that Indian contemporary dance involves speech and a lot of theater aspects, and Indian classical dance influences, I would like to ask, now that Indian classical dance choreographers are including speech in their margam itself, how does the scenario for Indian contemporary dance change? Would it remain the same even though in a lot of ways, the way Indian classical dance is performed or perceived is also changing? So let me see if I can rephrase this a bit. We are bringing in innovations into Indian classical dance performances that are more theater-based. I've seen that in works that have been coming up lately as well. So what does that mean in relationship to contemporary dance? Is contemporary dance also changing in similar ways right now? Is it being perceived as also evolving? I think that's the question.
I think all the forms are evolving, and I think what the classical dancers are struggling with, but I don't think there should be an anxiety about it, is that people are losing interest in the classical. So they're trying to find different ways of presenting the classical. But does that change the form? I don't think it does. Maybe it makes it more accessible to the younger generation, but I think classical dance has its own value. The margam has its own value and it'll never go, it'll always be relevant. So, this whole anxiety should stop, and sometimes I feel, when dancers are not trained in, like, earlier there used to be dance dramas. Dance dramas have always existed it's part of our tradition, but they were all very good at singing and they had some kind of voice training. So without that, speech could fall, if you're not trained in that voice or if you're not trained in singing. So, yeah, there are many problems. But as I said, there can't be a definition for what is contemporary, what is classical, because I know a lot of classical dancers who do very who just work with classical and the arrangement is different, but they feel they are doing contemporary and they have their own set of arguments. So how do how can we all define what is contemporary?
And I think that's sort of like the dilemma that we kind of started to approach from a more general perspective as to, like, it's about process, right? So it's sort of like the whole thing about same wine, new bottle, new wine, old bottle, that kind of paradigm, right? Or that kind of metaphor when it comes to the packaging of Indian dance. Anybody else want to add to that question?
Yeah, I think we have to figure out ways to pass on these beautiful dance forms and traditions to the next generation in outside of India, especially. Language has always been an issue, right? We have students that don't understand Tamil or Sanskrit. So there's always a level of translation, or, maybe we act it out instead of, on a piece of instrumental music rather than the lyrics itself, because they don't relate to it or understand it. So we have to evolve to hope to help continue, training future generations, especially in the US, outside of India.
I know for me personally speaking, when it comes to what I think is really what our responsibility is to cultivate our new audiences. When I was performing in Chennai, for example, in very much the mainstream Sabha culture since 2007 to 2014, my audience is skewed old. older in the sense like of 65 and all that. That was my audience. My own friends who are outside of the dance community were not interested in classical dance. I did one performance, which was at Spaces, which was through a friend of mine who sponsored the performance. And because it was Spaces, the whole audience was very different. It was the Besant Nagar crowd versus the Mylapore T Nagar crowd in Chennai. So, but the response that I got was like, it was nice, but like they wanted something that would draw them in. So I feel like, you know, the language about how we talk about dance also has to be reflective of this need to be educative and to also be cultivating an audience to understand, not in a very pedantic kind of like the sun, the lotus, the bee. No, much more nuanced than that, because we can't underestimate our audiences either. So there's an audience that is interested in classical dance, but needs a not very literal approach to describing it. Like sometimes people want to be challenged. A lot of our audiences that come to see, say, contemporary dance also like the idea of being challenged as an audience. What can classical dance do to do that? It isn't this over explanation that I'm seeing in performances or this overuse of speech in the Madhgam. So I'm kind of critical in that sense because I come from it from this perspective, because my students have to be interested in what I do. My students have to be interested in what the form has to do. You know what I mean? So I think about like the next generation of an audience to be educative in that sense. And then also about where I'm located. Anyway, Aparna, yes, you have something to add?
Also, I think there is this notion that everybody should like everything. They don't have to. There is a group of people who will only like classical, the so-called classical dances, and then there are certain people they'll only like the Bollywood or the dance theater or uh, theater of social justice or whatever. So there is audience for everything, and I think there are like overlapping things that happen. I remember this production Dr. Lalita Srinivasan did called Anveshane, which is she's a hardcore Bharatanatyam choreographer, but the theme was about looking for God or questioning God or thinking of existence of God. It's like a big, Bergman kind of question, or laid out like it's a very philosophical question, but the journey was through a particular one form. There was no, like, not much of like, taking from different forms to tell the story. So she went with what was very strong with her, like, so I think, do we call that contemporary or Bharatanatyam, or it doesn't matter what we call, and there is an audience for that, and then there is an audience for encounter, and there is an audience for what Uday Shankar did and what Amala Shankar did and so on. I think there is I think we have to allow that to happen. And at the same time, I understand what you're saying, that there is a way that we need to educate, especially when we are not in India. Like, even within India, there is a way we have to inform the audience without being preachy. There are like large number of people go to opera or ballet. It's not like they know Latin and, they're like, oh, every single word they're appreciating. No, they're just going for the musicality of it or the physicality in the ballet, or so. And then when you do a piece from Ramayana or Mahabharata, most people know, and then in India at least, and then when you translate into a different culture, maybe there is a way we give that information without being like you said, one day Krishna,
Yeah. Meena and I have spoken about this at length too. It's about also what happens with the next generation. See, even in India, when I was there, 2007 to 2014 was a very interesting and volatile time, only because urban India changed very rapidly with the onset of social media, smartphones, and all that. And so right away, you can see a very quick and very rapid change in tastes and all that, and access to a lot more of global culture, which is, of course, fueled by capitalism and obviously Western influences. So you have that kind of phenomenon happening where it's now affected the next generation of potential dancers, whether they're here in the US, in Singapore, or in India. The urban youth have really undergone a massive change. And we have to also take that into consideration when cultivating our audiences. And so I kind of wanted to end with that, saying that, you know, we shouldn't ever lose this quest, this personal quest for movement. But I think also there is, on the other hand, as Kalpana had said, there's an audience for everything. And then on the other hand, again, there is also the need to be able to cultivate audiences as well. And I think it's a fine balance between artistic integrity and not having to justify artistic decisions that you make about a piece, but also informing them of why such decisions were made might be interesting to an audience to hear too. So it's kind of like a give and take. So with that, I wanted to say thank you once again to Aparna Sindur, to Raka Maitra, and to Meena Basunag, and to IDEA for hosting this amazing opportunity to do a panel discussion. And I thank each and every one of you for joining us this evening. And for those of you who are planning to join us afterwards on YouTube, thank you. And we would like to just end with a quick announcement. We're having one more screening next week, and then of course later on in April. The next screening will be Janaka Janaka Payal Bhaje, and that'll be moderated by Madhavi Reddy. And details of that will be also available on ideadancers.org and on their social media as well. And so like that, it'll be basically discussing the evolution of classical dance in Indian cinema. So I wanted to just thank everybody for coming here this evening. And I wanted to thank the panelists once again, Shruti, Mukund, the team at IDEA, Krishna Veni, for having me. And thank you and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you, Kiran.
Thank you, Kiran. Thank you, everybody.
Everyone.
Thank you.
Good night.
Tata.
Thank you.
Thanks, Meena.